Okay. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our third and final lecture that's being hosted by Bridges for Peace Canada and Winnipeg Friends of Israel. My name is Reverend Peter Fast, and I'm the National Director of Bridges for Peace Canada. Just a couple things by way of beginning tonight, this evening's time. The Executive Director, Mike Fegelman, who is in the poster and was expected to be our main speaker tonight representing Honest Reporting, is absent due to illness. And so we have Robert Walker, who is stepped in, and he's going to receive a full-fledged introduction. And Robert Walker is part of Honest Reporting, and I'll leave that up to Yolanda, who's going to introduce him. So we still have a speaker. We still have a speaker from Honest Reporting. The title and the subject has not changed, only the speaker. But we welcome Robert Walker this evening to Unveiling Media Prejudice Against Israel. So I wanted to first start off with just a few things by way of introduction of Bridges for Peace. We'll show you a short film as well. Some of you may have seen this, but if you are new to this webinar tonight and haven't caught the other two, then this will be the first time you are seeing this. Bridges for Peace, we are Christians supporting Israel and building relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. We're an incredible organization that has been around since 1976, internationally based in Jerusalem, Israel, the one and only. And we're around the world in 8 different nations. And there's kind of 2 sides to the same coin of what we do as an organization. We are building bridges between Christians and Jews. And so as an organization, we reach out to the church, to the greater church, to all different denominations and congregations, pastors, all kinds of people to fundraise, raise donations. We have prayer support, we have seminars and lectures, and we speak in churches. And the message that we bring is there's multiple messages, but one of the foundations that we start on are the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith. We recognize throughout church history, much of church history, we have persecution often propagated against the Jewish people on behalf of people that called themselves Christians and represented the church. And so we oppose anything in our past that has skewed what we believe, how God sees Israel and the Jewish people. We see the value in the entire Bible. We see our connection going back even to the 1st century. Jesus, the disciples, they were all Jewish. And this is the root that what would become Christianity was grown from. And so we're connected. In fact, in the Newer Testament, it says we're grafted in. And this is something that much of the church over the centuries has lost. It has led to, not by all, but by many people calling themselves Christian, it has led to Christian anti-Semitism. And so as an organization, we also speak about not only God's faithfulness to Israel and our belief that God still has a covenant with Israel and the importance of the land and that God is bringing the Jewish people back to Israel, but we also address issues of replacement theology, the belief that God transferred the covenants that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and gave them to the church. And these kinds of theologies also gave way to anti-Semitism in the name of Jesus and these kinds of things. And so we seek to educate and resource the church. We also provide tours to Israel, discipleship tours, volunteer opportunities in Israel, opportunities for Christians to get involved and connect with Israel, both through faith and spiritual seeking, but also through the incredible miracle of modern day Israel. And then we also build bridges with the local Jewish communities in our nations. And so that's what you're seeing a bit of tonight. But in Israel, we have some incredible programs, and it's all donor-based, donor-driven by Christians all over the world. And so the programs we have in Israel, we're feeding over 22,000 needy Israelis. We repair homes, we work in schools, we work with Holocaust survivors, we visit people that have been affected by terrorism and war, especially just recently. We provide bomb shelters. We work even in the Christian Allies Caucus and the government, when we work with the religious community in the Orthodox world. to schools and municipalities, mayors, social workers, and we do some incredible work, all to bring us together. Because even despite differences that we may have, we actually share a lot in common. And that is one thing that is really on our heart as an organization, to draw us together. So before we watch this short video, I'm also going to say that after Robert speaks, Yolanda will introduce him, and after Robert gives a brief introduction, we're going to do tonight a little bit different than the previous two lectures. We're going to do it more of a Q&A style. So we're going to devote most of the time to your questions, for Robert and honest reporting, and it'll give a chance for Robert to really just shed light on the organization of honest reporting, what they're up against, and how we all can be involved, okay? And I will be fielding those questions. So without further ado, I invite you to just watch this short video of Bridges for Peace.
Bridges for Peace. Christians supporting Israel and building relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. Bridges for Peace, 50 years of blessing Israel and the church through compassion and revelation. Compassion. Feeding Israel's hungry. Caring for Israel's needy. Repairing homes. Giving hope to children in poverty. Helping the Jewish people return to their ancient homeland. Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Revelation, bringing the Bible to life in its ancient context, revealing the truth of Israel's prophetic significance, telling the story of Israel's miraculous rebirth, connecting Christians and the Jewish people through a grassroots global team of Christian representatives. For God's instruction shall go forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Bridges for Peace, a Matthew 25 ministry dedicated to supporting the nation of Israel and bridging the centuries-old gap between Christians and Jews. Bridges for Peace, your Israel connection.
Thank you, Peter. Just a moment. Thank you, Peter, for this introduction. I will just introduce Winnipeg Friends of Israel really quickly and our speaker for tonight. Winnipeg Friends of Israel is a grassroots organization. As you know, we established it in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge. It was established by a group of activists that felt the need to disseminate Israel's narrative because of a biased media. We felt that the media as a whole presented an unfair, out of context, and a very partial report about Israel, and we wanted to do something to change it. As the years evolved, we have managed to help change perceptions about Israel by organizing rallies, reaching out to other communities, but especially through education. If we thought that we made strides during the years, Operation Guardian of the Walls proved to us that our work is even more important and needed in 2021. We're very proud to stand with Israel, and we will continue to do our part to fight anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism where and when it's needed. If you're on Facebook, I urge you to click like on our page so you can see our posts. And I also ask you to share our posts so your friends would see it as well. In the past month, we had successful events, and we are going to share some of the videos with those of you who are not able to attend. And I'm sure that you're going to find the event tonight extremely valuable. I am very excited to present to you Robert Walker. Robert Walker is the Marketing and Community Relations Associate for Honest Reporting Canada. Previously, he served as an executive director for Hasbara Fellowship Canada, and I think I spoke with him before, but then he stepped down and Daniel Koren came to talk to us, a leading pro-Israel student educational organization. He has also led communication strategy for Israel's embassy in Ottawa and has spoken to pro-Israel audience throughout North America. He oversees community Israel education for Honest Reporting Canada. Welcome to Winnipeg, Robert. And I'm wondering, maybe we can just start until we get some questions with maybe tell us a little bit about what Honest Reporting actually does and some of your experiences with the organization.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, of course, Yolanda and Reverend Fast, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to speak even virtually to the holy city of Winnipeg, and I hope to visit very soon. So as Yolanda, as you mentioned, of course, I work for Honest Reporting Canada, and what we are and what we do, of course, many of you, perhaps most, perhaps some, are familiar with us, but if not, what we are is really an independent grassroots organization promoting fairness and accuracy in Canadian media as it relates to Israel and the Middle East. And so many of you are familiar through some of the things like the action alerts, the daily briefings, when you read something in the news or hear something on the radio and, fire shooting out of your ears and you can't believe this has been published. 99 times out of 100, it's something that we know as well. And we do everything from, writing rebuttals, which we frequently do, to doing outreach directly with editors and the journalists themselves, letting them know whether it's small corrections or errors or really bigger egregious issues. And there's actually one in Winnipeg that I dealt with a couple of days ago, and I'm happily talk about that. We do webinars once a month. We have podcasts weekly. So honestreporting.ca is where you can check all that out. Actually, today we just recorded and released a podcast talking about the Iranian propaganda campaign against Israel. It's pretty remarkable stuff, just talking about that, some of the research that we were doing. And that's all as it really relates to the media. And again, happily talk about any one of the different issues that we talked about, but really it's what started, I think, 20 odd years ago as a media watchdog has really become something much more comprehensive and much more all encompassing, which is, it's not just about, responding, it's about being proactive and trying to educate not just journalists, but the community as well. And I don't just mean the community, Jews and Christians who are friends of Israel, but really the wider community who is unaware and uneducated because, they're not digging deep in the information because they have soccer practice and mortgage and 100 other things. They don't have time to dig down what they're reading on CBC. Whether that's true or not. And so we're there really as a resource as well for them.
Thank you, Robert. I'm just wondering, before we get more questions, maybe you can tell us what happens when you find an article or you're being, somebody's writing to you about an article that seems to be unbalanced or out of context, full of lies. What is the how do you deal with it?
Well, I think a big part of it has to do, Yolanda, with two factors. One, which is, do we have a history of, issues with this particular journalist or this particular outlet? I think that, most people can see the difference between, and again, particularly when there's a relationship, with that the Mike Fegelman, the executive director of Honest Reporting Canada has, we can usually tell, okay, was this an honest mistake? Because again, think of how anti-Israel activists typically phrase this entire conflict. It's, they stole our land, they murder babies. It's very easy to understand, the world according to anti-Israel activists. It's very simple. Obviously, we know it's egregiously false, but it's extremely simple. Whereas, and here's the messaging issue on our part, which is, what is our message, right? Is it that Israel has a right to defend itself? Is it, which kind of sounds a little wishy-washy, of course it does, etc. So I think their side, when you remove ethics and morality and truth and balance, it's very easy to have a very simple, non-convoluted message. And so I think that's one of the issues. And so what happens is, first we need to determine, the nature of this journalist. Is this an honest mistake? We can't get in someone's head, but we can tell, okay, is this somebody who's had a continued issue of repeated egregious problems? And there are many, unfortunately, journalists who have that. And then is there somebody else for which maybe they made a source, or they sourced something that's, it's probably an honest mistake. And so I think typically we come out either way, we're coming out diplomatically and assertively, but it really depends on whether we do it a public rebuttal. Of course, we'll try to get it published in that particular publication. And then, for example, last week, there was a whole back and forth that we had in one of the newspapers in Prince Edward Island, which is not known for its, hotbed of anti-Israel activity, but there was somebody there who wrote just one of the most bonkers anti-Israel articles that could be seen, just full of absolute nonsense that was responded to. So that's one. But then, like I said, a lot of it is really personal one-on-one relationships too, which is, hey, listen, there was an error here, etc. This is something that needs to be fixed. But really, when I would say 99 times out of 100, when you're reading something, you're having your morning coffee and you spit out the coffee because you're reading in the paper or something you can't believe, we are almost certainly, already in touch with journalists at that point. We're already either formulating rebuttal or directly doing outreach to those journalists at that time, whether it's sending out an alert, to our 45, 50,000 subscribers, letting them know, because again, I can tell you, and this is something Mike says, that we can say with absolute confidence that every time you write a letter to the editor, every time you write a letter to, a publication saying that you take issue or umbrage with reporting, those get logged and those get reported. And I know that we can feel very disenchanted and say nobody listens, nobody cares, nobody's paying attention, but absolutely they are. And I think that apathy is a major enemy of effective outreach and effective advocacy. So really, we have to get that, those negative thoughts out of our head, because the moment we start to feel helpless and disenchanted that, it's there's nothing to do. No. Whenever you read something, do two things. One, contact Honest Reporting Canada. Two, contact the outlet directly. Be polite, but be direct and say why it has an issue. Why there's an issue with it. So, absolutely it has an impact. And we have many, many successes of corrections, not just of corrections, right? But really when they publish, our rebuttals on, or ours or that of our subscribers. So I think we have a very, proud track record. And that's really as a result of, people who are sitting there and reading and not liking what they're reading and making sure that their voices are heard. So you play an absolute integral central role.
Thank you, Robert. I'm just gonna just remind everyone, and I see we got our first question put into the chat, but everybody, you can see at the bottom of your webinar screen, it'll say Q&A or chat. If you have a question, I prefer just throw it in the Q&A, but if you can't see that or you end up typing it in the chat, I'll be monitoring both. So the first question here, Robert, for you is from Brad. He says, what is the most effective tool of civil disobedience directed towards skewed media reporting as conducted by CBC, Toronto Star, and Winnipeg Free Press, and politicians who have expressed allegiance to Israel but have not spoken out in support of Israel's situation? He gives one example of an MP here in Winnipeg South, James Carr.
So, all right, well, that's a tough question. I think I'm done for the evening. No, I will. So really, okay, so I'll break that down. So first of all, Brad, thank you for that question. So first of all, what's the most effective tool of civil disobedience directed towards skewed media reporting? So one is, make your voice heard. You have to contact them directly. And that's what I just said. I know I just said it a couple of minutes ago. So really, there's two things, actually. One, obviously, contact Honest Reporting Canada, honestreporting.ca. And that's one. And two is contact them directly, because, if you share this on Facebook or share this on Twitter or share this on LinkedIn or tell your friends or tell your spouse or your cousins or your next door neighbors, that's great. But they need to hear it from you directly. And even better, email your friends about it. Create a little group. If only there was a group, almost like a Winnipeg Friends of Israel, let's say, and there was such a group, so tell Yolanda, tell, Reverend Fast. And I think that there's, of course, tell Honest Reporting. So I think that there's power in numbers, but you absolutely need to make sure that your voice is heard. I know it sounds like, okay, well, what else is there? But the reality is we can't skip stage one to go to stage two. Stage one is really, really critical. Now, of course, if you're dealing with, long-term egregious, journalists, who are just historically very problematic, it's a different story. I would suggest reaching out honestreporting.ca and again saying, well, what do we do with this? Because like I said, 99% we are already dealing with. We don't have the power to, tell journalists what to say. Well, this is a section 2B of our charter guarantees thought, belief, opinion, expression, and it's a cherished Canadian ideal. At the same time, we have the right also to challenge misinformation. But again, we don't know everything and we can't be everywhere. And so we do rely on people letting us know, and speaking out directly as well. And that's one. With respect to politicians, perhaps a little bit outside our bailiwick, but really I would say it's the same thing. MP Carr, I know he had cancer a couple of years ago. I don't know how he's been doing. I know he had stepped down from his cabinet post, but I would suggest reaching out to these people directly. Some of them are approachable. I don't know his particular, how approachable he is, how responsive he's been. I believe he's even Jewish, if I'm not mistaken. But again, that doesn't, always mean anything. But my understanding, he is quite, like I said, as Brad said, a supporter of Israel. I would say, it's worth reaching out to these people and directly and saying, listen, private words of support are lovely, and that is a good thing, and thank you for that, but we need you to step up. We need you because especially over the last month, the last 6 weeks when we had the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, we all know that the upsurge in anti-Semitism, Jews getting yelled at and assaulted and verbally abused, was significant and very worrying. And it's precisely at those points when a private pat on the shoulder is nice, but it's simply not good enough. And they need to be told that.
That's a good answer. We have another one submitted question. How do you address, with Honest Reporting, how do you address celebrities or stuff like this? Celebrities posting on their Twitter feeds or podcasts, or we could just branch that out to social media bias in general, which is just going crazy. It's just a spew of it. How do you address this? Does Honest Reporting address social media bias towards Israel, just full blood out anti-Semitism? How does Honest Reporting respond to these things?
It's a good question. I think Honest Reporting, really, we focus in terms of, I think, the context of, Canadian media bias. So, for example, here's where there's a bit of a gray area, which is, if we have a celebrity or an influencer, last couple of weeks, someone I never even heard of, Haddad, was it Bill? I don't know the world of, of early 20s fashion people based in LA. Regrettably, it's not an area of expertise. But these people have, in the last month, become international geopolitical experts, of course. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, when you've got 40 or 50 million, as I said, there's two sisters of Lebanese descent who are Bella and Gigi Haddad, who have become, who are big, Hollywood celebrities and influencers with tens of millions, and they're anti-Israel, and they've both been posting quite significant. And this is one of the news. There's also actually a Canadian fellow, an actor, Seth Rogen, a Jewish guy from actually Vancouver, who unfortunately has come out as quite an anti-Israel voice, which is particularly egregious. It's disappointing. So where Honest Reporting Canada deals, we don't deal with, let's say, sort of Twitter celebrities, etc. But we do have instances, for example, when there are journalists. And so, for example, there was a journalist a couple of weeks ago from the Globe and Mail who posted on his own Twitter feed, some pretty anti-Israel, egregious, misinformation as well. And so that's something that we make sure to screen cap, and we make sure to, to publicize as well, because this is, and believe me, and this is the kind of stuff where when I said, I know I sound like a broken record, but we can't be everywhere. We can't see everything. So if you see something from a journalist, particularly somebody, like I said, so somebody who writes for the Winnipeg Free Press, but follow them on social media too, because you know what, sometimes they'll have one persona here and they might say something that's completely different, and they need to be called on that. And who knows, it's something that that there's a possibility of engaging with them directly, or if not, possibly with their bosses or their editors as well. So where Honest Reporting Canada, like I said, is I think where you more have journalists and reporters on their social media platforms, which again is quite significant, as opposed to maybe, Russell Brand is mentioned, or Seth Rogen, etc. As egregious and frustrating as that is, ours is really the focus of, journalists and media and sort of, and again, that could be social media, that could be blogs, webinars, podcasts, newspapers, radio. So we certainly have our hands full.
Yeah. Well, I got a question, and Yolanda, you can jump in whenever, when you have something, but when you come across something and you address it in the media, how do these media outlets, newspapers, stations, etc., how do they typically respond to you when you point out error? Like when we're not even a misunderstanding. I mean, you can email a journalist directly, but let's say there's something major that you have to respond to, a major company of whatever kind. What's the relationship like? How do they take honest reporting, pointing these things out and coming to them with the facts that you come to them with? What do you find across Canada with these media outlets when you approach them? Do you find them cordial, respectful? Do they oh, sorry, we didn't know this, or do they kind of tell you to back off? Or how are you received?
So it's an excellent question. And I think, again, it depends on the kind of person. So I would say it's two categories primarily. One, which is, I would say in most cases, and this is really a bigger question people ask a lot, are journalists biased? I mean, every human being is biased to some degree, but are journalists, they have a bone to pick. What's going on? How can we explain this anti-Israel propaganda and anti-Israel misinformation in the news? How do we can't understand it. So that's a bigger question I'm happily answer as well. But I think one is, in the vast majority, I don't know, I hesitate to give a number to this, but really in most cases of journalists and editors, they really are open and receptive. The proviso being, it depends how we approach them, right? So, and again, this is where relationships are critical. So, Honest Reporting Canada, it's all about relationship building. If we come in and say, you're an idiot, you wrote this, obviously it's, self-evident, schoolyard taunts aren't going to work. And so it's really based on relationships. Journalists may come and go from an outlet, but they're going to stick around most likely in the, in the industry. And of course, their editors are going to be there longer term, even if journalists may come and go. So I think when we have a situation, most journalists are genuinely open-minded. Most journalists, I think, genuinely, they have biases, like every human being has biases, but they are genuinely, certainly in our experience, open to being corrected, assuming it's done obviously in a professional, cordial way. Then we've got minority with 10% maybe. I don't really, I hesitate to, like I said, to give a number. And these are the people for whom I don't know what's in their head. I don't know whether they have a bone to pick. They come into the office every morning saying, I'm going to slander and libel Israel. I think it comes from, they have a particular worldview. It could be laziness. It could be, intellectual laziness. I think it could be, there's a particular worldview, but I think generally it could be a combination of that, where they just genuinely see Israel in a particular light. They genuinely see Israel as the strong, particularly in today's sort of, milieu. I think they see Israel as the strong power, which automatically translates to being the villain. They see Israel as, the other side, like I said, the anti-Israel activists. Their message is clearer, it's more succinct. Israel stole our land, Israel murdered our babies. You don't need to have a PhD in political insight to understand what that's talking about. Meanwhile, like I said, I think our side, when you're trying, but that's just because the analogy I always like to use is what our opponents are doing is pushing a boulder down a hill. Just as Hamas doesn't care what they kill, whether they fire a rocket into a kindergarten or a school or a gas station, they are a hospital, they don't care, as long as they kill Jews. So they're pushing it. Meanwhile, what we're trying to do is we are trying to push a boulder up a hill, which is we're trying to educate people about, the truth of the Middle East. And I think that is really because and I use that term very purposely, Reverend Fast, where I don't say pro-Palestinian, because I make a distinction between pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, right? I think legitimate voices can have legitimate criticism of Israel, as we've said and everybody has said since day one. But I think the difference is when there are voices which seek to demonize and delegitimize Israel and apply double standards, that's not pro-Palestinian, because they're not helping anybody's cause, least of all the Palestinians. And there's many issues, I happily talk about, like I said, some instances where no Palestinian is being helped, for example, by the boycott movement against Israel, right? They're just trying to demonize Israel. They're pushing the boulder down the hill. So it's a lot harder, like I said, to push a boulder up than push it down. So in those situations, I think, that helps to explain why some of these journalists, where you see a repeated issue of anti-Israel misinformation, why that's happening, I think, because I'm not in their heads and I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think the issue is because genuinely it's easier to answer, it's easier to depict Israel as the aggressor, as opposed to understanding the real complexity of the Middle East, where you have two peoples and a tiny sliver of land, and you have legal rights and moral rights and historical rights all at play. And it's, nothing is perfect, and Israel's not perfect. And you've got, the pro-Israel side saying, honestly, Israel's not perfect because it's not perfect. And then the other side says, yeah, Israel, you're right. Israel's not perfect. It murders babies and harvests organs and, uses, Christian baby blood for I don't think they said, but, obviously, but I think that's how, for Mutz, of course, that's the old blood libel. But I think what you're seeing today, actually, I mentioned that, is there is unfortunately a use of a lot of these, very, ancient kind of hate messaging, like blood libels, that are frequently popping up in the Arabic media. And then unfortunately, sometimes we see that being, published here. And I'll give you another example in a minute, but I think we have an issue where there's a lot of misinformation coming from around the world, and, Iranian disinformation, etc., that's being therefore sometimes peddled or repeated in Canadian media. And that's a very scary thing, because we might be able to determine where that came from, but someone reading that, they don't know the difference between truth or fiction. Because again, if you read something on a topic that you didn't know anything about, or I did, how do we know the difference of what's truth or fiction? We don't know. And that's, again, why the role of not just honest reporting, but the role of individuals who needed to step up and say, hold on, this is the truth, and this is fake.
I just want to add something, and I see that Sylvia wrote about it, and she said the phrase "they stole our land" this land does not belong to the Jews for 2,000 years or more years ago. So I think there is a frustration, because there is sort of an attempt to revise history. Yes. And it seems that a lot of these revisions of history, people accept them as if they are the truth. And we are very frustrated with the fact that the true history, or the true facts, are not coming out. And I think Sylvia expressed it really well. We have another question here from Brad, and he wants to know if demonstrations in front of media outlets that repeatedly single out Israel and are not being truthful, or just use half-truth and out of context statements, if demonstrations and petitions could help.
So I mean, listen, that is not necessarily our area of expertise in terms of, public. I would say, listen, always making your voice heard is a very important, critical thing. And I would say, it has to be up to the individuals to determine, whether protesting publicly, whether a petition, whether letter writing, whether, a demonstration, like I said, is the best way. And again, I think it depends on context. One of the important things I would just, on my own say in terms of, public, voices, is that, when we have letter writing, for example, 5 letters can make a difference, and that can be noticeable. You have a protest with 5 people, I think the optics could be sometimes quite the opposite. It could suggest that, hey, listen, nobody cares about this, only 5 people. So again, that's just my own perception. That may or may not be the case. Again, that's not our area of expertise in terms of, that particular method. Our method really is, holding, Canadian news media to account in terms of falsehoods and misinformation as it relates to Israel and the Middle East. So what I would say is, but either way, the principle you land is the same, which is make your voice heard. Again, it's not up to me to say, because every situation is different, right? Whether, one situation calls for a demonstration, and I'll give you an example. I don't know last month whether there were any protests or pro-Israel rallies in Winnipeg. I suspect that they were. There was something, certainly in Toronto. I know Montreal. I think Calgary, Vancouver. There were pro-Israel rallies, and again, these were organized usually without organizational support, and usually, overnight, because I think people just, that they were fed up and they were angry, and they wanted to make their voice heard in support of Israel, and they wanted, that voice to be seen or heard. So I would say that as long as you're making your voice heard and you're doing it in a responsible way that's going to reflect well on your voice, on your position, then I think you should do it. Again, whether something is more effective or less effective, that's not something that, again, depends on the situation. But I would say, listen, make sure your voice is heard, because if you don't, toot your own horn, no one's going to do that. If you don't speak out, no one's going to do that.
Yeah. I got a question here, Robert. And, some of what we've talked about and some of what you've mentioned there, Yolanda, and you're bringing up what Sylvia mentioned, how frustrating it is when rewriting historical revisionism and these things. And your analogy, Robert, of rolling a boulder down versus pushing it up, it's what the difficult thing with all of this too is that people on the other side often use these very emotional, sensationalist, revisionist statements. And I mean, anybody with half a brain can just say something out of nowhere, like they kill our babies. But then for people like us, it takes a lot of time to put something together to show that that is wrong. So you have this never-ending tide on the one hand of buzzwords, of accusations, of statements, and many of them, they're all kind of the same. Many of them are the same. I don't know if I've really heard anything brand new. I've even heard of things, claiming that Israel trains dolphins to spy on Palestinians. So things like this, but it takes time. And I want to segue into Cindy. Cindy here asked a question, and it relates a little bit to what Sylvia also said. She says, so because the damage is done when any of these articles come out, damage is immediately done, because you said a lot of people are intellectually lazy. They have all of these things. They're not going to do the research themselves. They read a real powder keg article, and that does immediate damage. Now, she says when the damage is already done with the rewriting of history, how long does it take until they retract the falsehoods, or how long until your rebuttal is published? Because both of these things take time. And I mean, I think the sentiment that she ends with, a lot of us feel like this, and this isn't putting a spotlight on just honest reporting, just generally. She says, if indeed it is effective, please convince me with the increase of anti-Jewish Israel sentiment that is indeed, that it's not indeed a losing battle. Like it does. And we just experienced, which is why we've had these 3 lectures in a row, a sudden, like we've seen anti-Semitism for decades and centuries, but a very public, brazen, angry, hateful anti-Semitism erupting in city streets all across this country. And there was a number of things that even happened right here in Winnipeg. So can you comment on that, with you bringing something to a major issue? How long does it take with a rebuttal? How long does it take honest reporting to publish something? And how effective is this?
Right. So, I mean, really, I think the first thing, when what you said reminds me of, a verse in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And I think that really what it means, in this context really is that everything you read, as it relates to Israel, every slander, the dolphins is an especially hilarious one, but this isn't being recorded, right? It's not true, guys. But I think what it really comes down to, really, in my experience, is a couple arguments that it all comes down to. It's apartheid, it's racism, and it's excessive force. These are really the claims that are made against Israel, right? That Israel basically, commits these horrible crimes against Israel, but really that it comes down to one or two things. So I think when you boil it down, it becomes a lot less intimidating. And I will tell you one of the, I wouldn't say technique, but one of the ways, because it can be very tempting, and what you mentioned is very tempting. You read an op-ed, for example. There was an op-ed actually in the on CBC News from a guy in Winnipeg this week, and it was you read it, Yolanda, and it was crazy. We put out a and essentially, it's very, very tempting to read that and feel tempted to respond to every single item in there. But if you do that, there's 2 issues. One, you'll be here till next week. But 2, just as importantly, is that you're letting them create the agenda, right? you are basically, it's the question of like, how often do you beat your wife? It's like, there's no right answer to that. I don't, right? You've heard that proverbial thing where it's like, well, so I think the important thing is it's important to answer the most salient, egregious lies. But then I think it's very important to point out what the bigger picture is. So for example, someone comes and says, Israel harvests the organs of Palestinian babies, and Israel murders babies, and Israel stole the land, and Israel did this. It's like, okay, like I said, we could write 20,000 words on why each one of those things are false. But I think it's very important to very briefly, very succinctly say why the most fundamental, thrust of the arguments, like I said, he might present 15 different arguments, but they most likely fall into 2 or 3 things. Like I said, there's nothing really new. It's all the same recycled, regurgitated stuff. But then ultimately what the bigger issue is, and 99% of cases, certainly in the op-eds and the rebuttals that you've seen, the honest reporting has written, it comes down to the intransigence on the part of the Palestinian leadership to accept Israel's right to exist. I mean, really, that's 95% of what we're talking about here. Whether let's say somebody thought, that Israel had no right to Judea and Samaria, right, commonly called the West Bank. Let's say somebody believed that Israel had no right to that. Now, obviously, it's our position that Israel has legal, historical, and moral rights to be there. It's not up to Rob Walker to say what Israel should or shouldn't do in terms of a final peace agreement. I have my own personal opinions, as we all do, but that's not what I'm saying right now. But I think it is very important. I think when we're arguing, in an op-ed or whether it's an op-ed, a proactive op-ed, or in a reactive rebuttal, I think we're, like I said, we're pointing out the egregious, most salient points, but then say, okay, enough of that, because again, we can't just be playing defense all the time. So we'll say, okay, but ultimately, what is the issue here? And usually it is, the CBC Winnipeg one, he mentioned the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe, right? Which refers to, of course, Israel's creation. And, and then he gives at the end this very poetic, very heartwarming thing. It says, well, I hope that, Jewish students in Israel one day will read a land acknowledgement saying they stole the land from the Palestinians, and we wrote something, that again, hopefully will be published soon, which essentially said, listen, that is obviously, we accept the right of the Palestinians to have a state of their own. This is certainly the position of the Israeli government. Again, whether it's individuals we may agree, as individuals we may disagree, but that is the position of successive Israeli governments of accepting a 2-state solution. Meanwhile, you have Hamas in their charter, which calls, says, oh Muslims, in the end of days, the trees will call on the Muslims that there's a Jew hiding behind, come and kill them. So I think, and this is in the charter of Hamas. So I think we have a bit of an issue when one side can't accept Israel's very right to exist. And then, of course, to say nothing of the incitement that you see in the Palestinian media, right? That, they're teaching little kids to glorify suicide bombings. So obviously we have a situation here where one side has made painful concessions for peace, as Israel did in 2005, forcibly, evicted 10,000 Jews from their own homes, kicking and screaming. And it was this terrible, internal crisis. And of course, they've made multiple peace offerings in 2000, Camp David, right? Where they offered basically everything but the kitchen sink. I think they offered that too. And it was, of course, rejected. It wasn't just rejected, but Arafat, of course, doesn't even come back with something else. He starts the Intifada. And so again, the most salient points is that the refusal of the Palestinian leadership, whether that's Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, to accept Israel's right to exist. It's the incitement that they are not just not accepting Israel's peace offerings. It's not just that they're not presenting peace offerings of their own. It's that they are brainwashing the entire next generation of poor Palestinian children, who instead of having a normal childhood of fun and games and coexistence of peace and optimism and a bright future, it's about I want to be a martyr, I want to be a mujahid and blow myself up in a room full of Jews. Right. I mean, and I think that the more we communicate that, those are the issues, right? You can tear down houses in a settlement, you can tear down a wall. Again, whether it's your belief or my belief that Israel has the legal, and I certainly believe that it has a legal, ethical, and moral right to be there, historical right to be there, ultimately Israel will make those painful concessions for peace if it determines that it's the important thing to do so. But like I said, you can tear down houses and walls and whatever, but the one thing you can't bring back, is these people who have been murdered. And I think that it is absolutely critically important that we hammer that again and again and again, which is, unless we get to that point where they accept Israel's right to exist, then literally everything else is just, we're just talking in circles. And I don't think people fully recognize that they really, I think two men, understand this as it was described to me once, two bald men fighting over a comb, which I don't fully understand that analogy, but whatever. But I think the idea here is, I'm constantly watching my own hairline, very careful of that day. But I think the issue really is that yes, there are two peoples who live in a small land, and both peoples have a right to be there. And we understand that nobody's going away, nobody's disappearing tomorrow. But what's the solution moving forward? And I think the more that you see a delegitimization and demonization of Israel that takes place, among Hamas and its sympathizers, and the same message, is very important that we rebut very, very assertively that. Now, obviously, the case I just talked about, and I'll stop here. I know you want to ask a question, but that's an exception. I would say in most cases, and that's a guest voice, in most cases, you really do. And I'll talk about another one, the University of Saskatchewan student newspaper had the most unbelievable, egregious, and we had it removed, actually. We didn't even ask for it to be removed, but we contacted them a couple of weeks ago. We said, please, it was a rebuttal, and they removed it. We didn't even ask it. And of course, then the news, CTV Saskatoon, or I think it was, talking about Honest Reporting Canada, the shadowy, organization. We didn't even ask for it to be shut down. We just had a rebuttal. So again, I think it's recognized that in the vast majority of cases, journalists don't have an agenda here to demonize Israel. But sometimes when you have guest voices, etc., it is critically important that we speak out, not just about the individual thing, but we don't let them set the agenda. Because like I said, if that's the case, they'll be saying, they'll throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks, and we'll be playing defense all day long.
I just have a question to, we all read the article in the CBC by the head of the Islamic Association here in Manitoba, and we were all horrified by it. But you said that you were writing something. Who are you sending it to? Is CBC going to publish it, or are you going to publish it in your correspondence?
Because that's still in the works, maybe I shouldn't give too much detail, but I can tell you typically, for example, what would happen is that, obviously in most cases when there's something particularly, we're not talking like a little correction, Israel did this and there's a little fact wrong. We're talking about when there's a guest voice, again, that's just pure, and it's usually 99% of the case, it's an opinion piece. It's not a news piece, which opinion pieces are totally fine. And, being critical of Israel is totally fine. But again, it's when there's just, real misinformation that's being provided. So we would usually pitch it to that outlet first, and we would say, please publish this rebuttal. And often they will. Like I said, not all the time, but often they will. And if they do, fantastic. And if they don't, then what we would do is we would publish it on our own website, honestreporting.ca, and then we would send it out to our 50,000 subscribers for them then to speak out. Because we're playing a long game here as well. Like I said, in the short term, we would love to have, articles and op-eds and podcast webinars, et cetera, that are, egregiously anti-Israel corrected. And we certainly try that. But listen, if they don't publish it, there's nothing we can do about that, but publish it on our own, send it out to our large and growing list, but then also try to continue that outreach and that relationship building with the powers that be at that outlet to say, listen, you might not have published our piece now, but we have an issue that we need to deal with moving forward. And I think that, like I said, it's about winning the war. Of course, we want to win as many battles as we can, but we can't win every battle despite our best efforts. And so when we can't, we then at least want to make sure that we can continue to win the war. And so then to answer actually, Reverend Fass, I know I'm doing a lot of talking here. I just want to answer this very briefly.
You're the speaker.
But you mentioned something about, in terms of, geez, we're losing the war. How can we feel like we're winning here despite the truth? And I would say it depends on how we measure the impact of not just our work, but in general. How do we know we're losing? Where the people often ask us, we're losing. I would say, how do you know we're losing? Well, because there's anti-Semitism. I would say, well, certainly there's anti-Semitism. That's not new. I would say, but it's very easy for an individual to have one idiot, spray painting swastikas on synagogues or on garages or yelling "Free Palestine" at Jews in a Jewish neighborhood. It makes a lot of news, but that isn't necessarily representative, of course, of anybody beyond him. Right? Just as if I did something stupid, right, or something egregious or hateful against, the Muslim community, or Arab community, or anybody, right, people who wear purple shirts, right, people wouldn't say, well, there's an outreach, there's an incredible, uptick in anti-shirt hate or anti-purple shirt hate. I think that it may be the case, and there is absolutely an uptick in anti-Semitism in the last month. There's no question about that. And Jews are, according to Statistics Canada, the number one targeted group of hate crimes in this country. So we know that to be the case. At the same time, I think it was the Anti-Defamation League in 2019 or 2018 put out a study, and they found that I think it was only 8%, this is off the top of my head, but I think it was only 8% of Canadians harbored intensely anti-Semitic views. And they surveyed again, a whole bunch of, I'm just remembering this because I know we wrote something about this recently. They had surveyed anti-Semitic attitudes in a whole bunch of different countries, Canada, the States, a bunch of countries in Europe, South America. And they found that Canada, or Canadian population in general, was one of the least, was like the second or third least anti-Semitic country. And that's a wonderful thing. And I think that's in part of the work of all of us as a collective, like I said, whether it's Bridges for Peace or Winnipeg Friends of Israel or Honest Reporting Canada, really is individuals speaking out and educating our friends and family and peers and neighbors and coworkers and so on. So don't lose hope, and I would say it's very important that we don't think that the vast majority of Canadians are anti-Semitic. They're absolutely not. The vast majority of Canadians are not anti-Semitic. I think the vast majority of Canadians probably have misinformation being put into their heads about Israel. And I think that is where it's important that we effectively, communicate and, like I said, do that outreach and education. But, really, I think when you're speaking to people, and it's very encouraging to know when we speak to most people, they don't hate Jews, they don't hate Israel. They probably have some skewed, picture in their mind about what's going on, but that's not something that's unfixable.
There was a question within like the news media. Is the anti-Israel bias in the news media the accepted narrative within the journalistic world? And is pro-Israel coverage discouraged in the mainstream media? So not talking about like smaller newspapers, but global TV, CBC, we could even go beyond just like CNN, stuff like that.
Right.
Pro-Israel journalists, are they few and far between, or is there an accepted narrative? What is Honest Reporting? How do you guys see that?
So, again, I speak not as the executive director of Honest Reporting Canada, but
Right.
But I speak, obviously, somebody who works very closely with Mike. So, I want to say that, because we're talking about sort of, there's a certain psychological element to this. I can only speak for myself and how I personally perceive it. But the way I see it is that I don't think that there is some kind of a, call it a witch hunt or a sort of McCarthyism against pro-Israel journalists generally. I'm sure in some cases that's the case. What I would say is I believe there's probably an accepted narrative, for example, that Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria is against international law, right? That Jewish settlements in the West Bank is against international law. I think that is probably the accepted narrative, in my personal opinion, among journalists, right? If you ask most journalists, I think they would say that matter-of-factly,
Yeah.
right? They matter-of-factly as if, it's sunny right now or it's snowing right now, right? I think that is probably how most see it, right? Most probably see it as and that's not because they have an agenda necessarily. I think it's just because our opponents have done such an excellent job of communicating that Israel stole the land, that it's almost like it's an article of faith. Where it's like, of course, like Israel, of course, Israeli, settlements in the West Bank are illegal according to international law. And I think that when we communicate well, actually, it's not the case. If you're not familiar with the work of Professor Eugene Kontorovich, really remarkable stuff in terms of which I won't get into the legal rights. But again, it's very technical, and again, most people don't know that. When you read it, it's unbelievably eye-opening, or they learn about San Remo, things like that. But again, most journalists, that's not their expertise. They're not subject matter experts, and we're not asking. They don't need to be subject matter experts because they can't be, unless they're a Middle Eastern bureau chief. We would certainly hope that they are. Pardon me, but sometimes they get dropped in there, parachuted in there for budgetary or other reasons. And so one day they're covering, crime in Winnipeg or Vancouver. The next day they're the bureau chief in Jerusalem. So I think that is the case. But in most cases, we're dealing with people who they're not subject matter experts, right? I studied journalism in university. Mike Fegelman studied journalism in university. And again, they don't teach you, I think, it's communication skills, it's research skills. But again, today, when we're dealing with, you have to be first, that often is more important than you have to be right, and you have to be accurate. And I think that accuracy is often the first victim of this 24-hour news cycle we have, thanks to Twitter and Instagram and social media, where, hey, if we're not the first person that publishes this, we're wrong. But guess what? Doing something really quickly is not usually conducive to being accurate, right? I'll never forget, it's in a different context. My father always told me, whenever you're having, contractor work around the house, it's, quickly, it's either quick, it's on price, or it's high quality. Choose two of the three. You never can have all three, right? And I guess it's the same thing here, which is, you want it really quick, you want it really accurate, or you want it really comprehensive. choose two of the three, or at best one of the three, sometimes none of the three. But really, I think that's one of the issues that we're dealing with. But I would say that if you look at journalists as, these are people who, they're writing that, everybody says, the government, the Canadian government says, every government says, Israeli settlements are, are illegal against international law. I mean, heck, Donald Trump, right, had to move to the embassy to Jerusalem. It was not Eastern Jerusalem, of course. It's important to mention. They recognized the Golan Heights, but they didn't recognize, Judea and Samaria. So I'd say even in, where Stephen Harper, even here, we think of some of the most sort of, widely seen pro-Israel views, whether you agree or disagree with their policies, they did many of their policies, I think, were seen to be supportive of Israel. But even Stephen Harper, the rules of, foreign affairs didn't change its view that settlements were illegal. And I think that when you have journalists, they accept it's, like I said, an article of faith. Well, the UN says that. Well, again, you and I know how deeply corrupted so much, unfortunately, the United Nations can be, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I think they take this as like, it's kind of a given. But when you share with them that, well, actually, it's not really the case, it's a paradigm shift. It's an epiphany, right? Right. It's something that's totally, it's it's a conversion on the road to Damascus, as it were, the Christian audience. So, share, of course, in terms that we understand. So I think that's how, but again, they don't know that. And so when we share that, it's like, mind blown. So we need to share that.
Yeah, and I think those are some very excellent points. We probably have time for one more question. And actually, this kind of segues, is a little bit part of a question that I had written out, but I'm going to read it. Miriam sent a question here. Basically, like, we are preaching to the choir, and that's something like, we all have our choirs. We all have, you have your 50,000 people that will follow Honest Reporting, and Winnipeg Friends of Israel has Winnipeg Friends of Israel that are part of it. And Bridges for Peace, we have people that connect, and more, we try to reach out. Of course, we don't want to just live on a little island with our choir and, go down singing whatever song. We do our outreach. We want to educate people. We want to expand that horizon and challenge. But sometimes it feels, and I think it's not always the case, but it does feel sometimes that, are we preaching to the choir, or is this just the choir? But how do we get the other? And this is the part of that question. How do we get the other to read your work? How do we respond beyond your 50,000 or our people and Yolanda's? How do we take this message out? What are some good constructive ways that you could describe to everybody right now as panelists, not panelists, participants on this webinar? What could you leave them with as far as things that they could do to begin to go out and challenge people and draw people and shake them up with some of this stuff?
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, it's a great opportunity for me to once again just thank you for having me. And really, it's a tremendous audience. I think that people after 15 months of this are so zoomed out, of everything. We're all zoomed out, yeah. And it's tiring, but we're so close to the end. And so, I'll leave on that positive note anyway. But nonetheless, to get 50 something people, I think at one point we had 60 people, I think is a tremendous accomplishment. So well done. And I'm very impressed with that. So that's one, but really, I think that the concern is a valid one, which is absolutely, we need to be very, there's two elements. There's education, and then there's, wider, let's say, outreach. And I make a bit of a distinction. So what we're doing now is education, right? People here, I don't know, everybody on here, I don't know most of the people on here, but what we're doing here is internal education, which is, you're here because you're supportive of Israel. You might have specific criticisms of Israel, and that's fine. We all do. But again, I think the issue is that, we're here internally learning. This is, we're going to the gym right now, right? We're picking up the dumbbells. I picked up dumbbells once, but my understanding is that the more you do it, you're supposed to get bigger muscles. I think that's how it works. And so the idea is that that's what we're doing tonight. Tonight, we're doing the hard work. And, in the previous sessions, that's what you're doing, whether it's learning the techniques or whether it's learning the facts, you are doing that. Now, obviously, that is only half the equation. The other side of the coin is, what do you do with that information? So, you come on this presentation tonight, of course, and we said, wow, there was a, wonderful, hilarious, young man named Robert Walker, and we should have him in more often. And he talked all these wonderful things. And okay, well, great, but what do we do with that? So again, I think there's a couple elements. Obviously, you're speaking from the context of, Honest Reporting Canada. So what we would say is, listen,
Yep.
bookmark, if you're not already on our list, go to honestreporting.ca and get our emails and get our newsletters. We send like 3 or 4 emails a week. You don't have to get that many, but you can sort of sign up for how many. Send it to your send it to, again, I wouldn't say just send it to random people you don't know, because that's spam, and people are going to tune you out very quickly. But I would say, if you know people who, let's say you've had a conversation with them, you could say, hey, listen, hey, John, hope you're well. I know you were saying something like this, thought you'd be interested because we were talking about this. That's one. Or let's say you would say, I don't really know anybody like that. It's not the case. I'm working from home. I don't really have that. Fine. That's fine. So I would say, listen, if you're not on social media, then, share in the groups that you can. If you have, let's say there are political groups on Facebook that are, open-ended, Winnipeg, political gurus, or, Winnipeg, Middle East, or whatever. You can share it in places like that. But again, I think one of the most impactful things, let's say somebody says, I don't know social media. I don't know social media. I don't really have a wide connection to people. The most important thing that you can do is honestly subscribe to our alerts and respond and write directly to media outlets. Because best, of course, is if you reach out to your peers who are undecided about Israel. But if you don't have peers who are readily accessible, who are undecided about Israel, then you know what? The best thing to do, like I said, honestreporting.ca, like I said, we had a great podcast today. I recorded it, so you get to hear my silky voice talk about, Iranian propaganda campaign against Israel, which just unbelievable. Listen to it. It really is like incredibly chilling what Iran is doing. But I think take that, and when we read, when you read rebuttals and there's an alert, Mike in Honest Reporting sends it over an alert that says, CBC News or, the Winnipeg Free Press did, ABC, say, email them, right? Don't feel, disenchanted. Don't think that your voice doesn't matter. That is the most fundamental thing. Think of this as almost like almost like a house, right? The foundation is making your voice heard when there's misinformation. The next step up is, telling your friends, right? The next step up is, communicating to peers, and random Facebook groups and Twitter accounts and so on. But like I said, anybody and everybody, doesn't matter whether you are a hermit living on a mountain with as long as you have Wi-Fi, right? You can, or internet. We're all here on the internet, of course. So I think as long as you have that, which is everybody here, you can make your voice heard, and you can email a journalist when you see something that's a problem. You can contact them on Twitter. That's sometimes the best way to reach them. If you're not on Twitter, you can get on Twitter. And again, do it in a respectful way, point out specifically what's wrong with it. You know what? That has a bigger impact than most people imagine. So, and that's accessible to everybody. That's my point. We can talk about how organizing, Brad asked about rallies and demonstrations, and, fundraising was a wonderful thing for wonderful causes, organizing car rallies. There's a million things that people can do. And I think everybody has to do an internal sort of calculation. What are my skills? What kind of time do I have? What are the resources, whether it's time or money or contacts that I have to do things? But anybody and everybody can write a letter. I don't just mean a letter to the editor, but can, lodge a complaint when there's a problem, because like I said, that will keep you busy enough. There's 2 or 3 of those a day.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robert. Yolanda, do you have something to finish with?
I just get a feeling that you are very optimistic about the media, where I felt this time around that there was a shift. And if there was a sort of like a hidden agenda before, now it was all out, and the media was, without any shame, being one-sided altogether. And I'm sort of worried about the next time that we will see an escalation in the fights between Hamas and Israel. And I'm just wondering, what do you expect in the next round that probably will come? Because as we learned, the Israeli army is not looking for a victory picture anymore. It's not what they're after.
Right. So listen, I think what you're describing is, and listen, I try not to be a Pollyanna and just somebody who's, thinking that, oh, the world is perfect. You could certainly ask my wife. I'm not the most optimistic person in the world about most things. But here, I think there's 2 reasons I'm optimistic. One is because listen, we have to be optimistic, I think. I know that ultimately, I'm a person of faith as well. And I don't believe that I'm in ultimate control of the world. But it doesn't matter, if you're a person of faith or not. Like I said, I know I'm speaking to a group where many of us are, but whether or not, is that ultimately we can only do our best effort. We can only do our best effort. And ultimately, whether the rest is out of our control. We can only do, I know you're Israeli, Yolanda, that's hishtadlut, right? We can only do our best effort here. So that's it. That's one. And I think the more optimistic we are within realistically, again, not, head in a cloud, I think that we can honestly believe that most people are open-minded. Most people are good people. Most people, like I said, according to the polls, are not anti-Semitic, etc. So I think with all that, now, the other part of what you said, which is what do we do in preparation for the next time? And that's exactly why it's important now. That is exactly why, it's so important to make your voice heard when there's an alert or there's an issue, to contact these journalists directly and say, listen, there's a problem, because you know what, maybe next time some of these journalists who, if there was another war tomorrow, would have said Israel is occupying Palestinian land and genuinely believing that to be the case, maybe in a month or two, if they write something, we can correct it, or at least we can engage with them, because there are incredible stories of people who just their minds were changed, and what a novelty these days, actually being open-minded. But many people are open-minded, but we have to actually engage them. They're not going to change their mind if we don't engage them. So that's what we have to do in the interim period, Yolanda, before the next one. And I can tell you're not the biggest optimist when you say the next time, because everybody knows there's going to be a next episode. But again, I think that's what we have to do, is we have to be actively outreaching with them now. So next time, and again, I think that's also a part of the relationship building, which is, hey, you've never heard from me, but I'm here to complain. When they write something good, email them and say, I appreciate. It doesn't have to be the best prose or thing. Say, listen, I appreciate that. That was not an easy thing to write, but it was balanced and it was well written. Thank you. So you know what? Next time you write something and complain, they might be more open to it too, right?
That's a good advice. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Robert. We're a little over time, and we just want to say thank you to Honest Reporting. Even though Mike was sick, I'm so glad that he quickly rushed in there and provided an excellent resource in you and presenting Honest Reporting to us. I would say to every participant, if you do not follow Honest Reporting, you should. And this event has been recorded like the other two. I know the first one with Kasima Fees has been released on both Bridges for Peace and Winnipeg Friends of Israel Facebook. But we're also gonna edit and release Amiram's 2 weeks ago. This one will be edited, and we'll release a playlist for all three. If you've missed it, you can watch. At the end of that will also be we're in the editing process. We're going to add some information. So we'll add the website for Honest Reporting. Check them out. Check Bridges for Peace out, and check Winnipeg Friends of Israel. But thank you so much, Robert. I mean, this is such an enormous subject, but I'm glad Yolanda wrestled you, Honest Reporting, into this lecture series, because what we've seen is the issue of the normalization of anti-Semitism. We've seen the Israel's military challenges in being ethical and moral in fighting against a death cult of Hamas in Gaza. And then this lecture, we've seen the other troubling issue that all of us have faced, and that's the media bias, unveiling the media bias. So thank you once again for coming, and thank you everybody for participating. Yolanda, if you want to say any closing words.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much, Robert, and it was great finally meeting you, even though
Likewise.
it's on Zoom. And you really enlightened us, and I do feel a little bit more optimistic, because I was like many others thinking, well, what can I do? It's like we lost the battle, but maybe we didn't. Maybe we need to continue and try to change things. I also want to thank Shelley Feintak for connecting us with Honest Reporting. So thank you, Shelley. And we hope that we'll see good results with your work and our work, and all those who love Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to say, obviously, that, thank you again for having me. And Winnipeg, Winnipeg's community, Jews and Christians alike, is famous for its support for Israel. Not every community has this. And so you definitely should take a lot of pride in your work.
Thank you very much again. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Okay, well, take care, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Robert. Bye-bye.